As I gaze upon the contents of my computer's monitor for inordinate amounts of time, I often have, to accompany me, a cold can of LaCroix. I first started drinking flavored sparkling water because it was 0-calorie, yet vaguely reminiscent of soda, but now I really can't stand real soda's syrupy sweetness at all. This is my favorite flavor, pamplemousse, or grapefruit if you don't speak bougie. Its taste? Vaguely grapefruit-like. While the real thing initially bursts with acidity, and then, as you chew, cuts with sweetness, and then finally lingers with a bitter aftertaste, I can only consider Pamplemousse LaCroix to be a pathetic shadow of that complex flavor profile. And yes, I did consume a can of LaCroix and a whole grapefruit while writing this video script. Anyhow, they themselves characterize LaCroix as only having hints of flavor. It's almost fitting then that LaCroix has become a symbol, jokingly, for the often white, stereotypically affluent members of the young generation. Every part of this item carries that vibe, its hints of flavor, its goofy names, its froofy, colorful can, everything, down to its silent X carrying French name. Unlike the actually French sparkling water brand Perrier, LaCroix itself isn't French. It's named after St. Croix, an island in the Caribbean Sea, which is a US territory, being part of the Virgin Islands. This is therefore why the drink is pronounced LaCroix and not La Croix. The next logical question is how the island of St. Croix, with its French name, became a US territory. Christopher Columbus landed on the island in 1493 and named it Isla de la Santa Cruz, meaning Island of the Holy Cross. Immediately after their arrival, the indigenous people on the island, known as the Kalinago, attacked their settlement. This marked the first battle that Christopher Columbus ever had with a New World native population. Although the Spanish never fully colonized the island, most or all of the native population was either driven out or killed by the Spanish. Later on, in 1625, a group of English and Dutch settlers drove out the Spanish, who then were evicted themselves by French settlers. The island kept the same name, but translated into French as Île de la Sainte-Croix. The island was then bought by the Danish West India Company, and became a cotton plantation run on slave labor for over 200 years. Slavery was then abolished by the Danish in 1792, but it took until 1848 for the existing slaves to be emancipated. Twice, St. Croix was occupied by the British, once from 1801 to 1802, and then again from 1807 to 1815. This was due to Denmark-Norway's alliance with France during the Napoleonic Wars, but because Denmark-Norway didn't resist, no blood was shed between the colonial powers on St. Croix. Finally, in 1916, St. Croix was sold to the United States for $25 million in gold. And then, in 1981, the G. Heilman Brewing Company in Wisconsin introduced LaCroix to compete with Perrier, taking now the American pronunciation of this island. Was that a tiring dump of history? Boring, even? I apologize, but that was perhaps the point. If you're like me, you listened to that history and went, okay. Tuning out the genocide, murder, war, slavery, and imperialism, you're probably still thinking about a stupid, tasteless, fizzy drink. At least, I was, anyway. I also purposely started at the part when the Europeans settled, as if that's the beginning of this island's history. Although, quite honestly, the history of what happened predating the Europeans' arrival is quite hazy, seeing as the Spanish murdered the entire group of people who would have known it. So, why are we jaded to this sort of history? Why do we still, to some extent, herald Europeans as civilization makers and explorers? Warfare, slavery, imperialism, and genocide are phenomena that occur in every part of the world. But Europeans are just always the best at it. Do we just not care anymore? Why is the history of this island the history of European powers who passed it around like a hot potato? Who whitewashed history? Our instinct is that from childhood we were sold an extremely biased worldview. We suppose that at some point we were told directly that the European imperialist, or explorer, as they're often coded, were heroes, and that the indigenous were civilized by the Europeans and their way of life. In the essay Whitewashing in the Dutch Atlantic, the author, Enrique Salvador, opens with such an anecdote. He recounts a visit to a museum in Seville, Spain, while on a research trip. In a seasonal exhibit, he was horrified by what he saw. The exhibit was of the Spanish discovery of America. Aside from the jarring word choice, he explains being shocked by the depictions of peaceful Spanish ships landing in Mexico. The exhibit insinuated that it was the Aztecs attacking the settlers that caused Spain to have to retaliate and form New Spain. This is our vision of historical whitewashing, that it's a form of overt propaganda fed to us before we'd know any better. And, to be honest, this kind of education does happen in many places in the US and elsewhere. However, as Salvador notes as well, the history we learned as children was not this revisionist. We could always go to state-funded museums and see an exhibition of history that was more objective than that of the Spanish Museum, even if not completely faithful. I needed a different primary source, then, so I naturally grabbed my brother's third-grade social studies textbook. Social Studies Alive, horrifyingly the same exact one that I used as a kid. I started flipping through the pages, and what occurred to me was quite shocking, that it wasn't overtly incorrect at all. It starts with a section on indigenous cultures, or what we knew of them, at least, and continues to tell history from a seemingly nuanced perspective. In a section on the indigenous people's interactions with the California missions, for instance, the book details, California Indians became the main workforce at the missions. It was the Indians' duty to help construct mission buildings. They cut down trees for lumber and learned to make bricks and tiles out of clay. In return for their work, the mission Indians received food, clothing, and shelter. Anyone who broke the rules was punished, and anyone who ran away was chased by soldiers, captured, and brought back. Runaways and others who broke mission rules were often beaten. It continues, in a later section, the missionaries believed that it was their duty to teach their way of life to the California Indians. They thought Indians' lives would improve if they lived like the Spanish. Unfortunately, for most Indians, life got worse. Inside the missions, the lack of freedom made many California Indians unhappy. They had to give up their old ways of life, such as gender roles and religious beliefs, and were forced to live by the rules of a different culture. Some kept following the old ways in secret, but over time, many customs were forgotten, and native cultures began to fade. Even within the justified censorship necessary for a children's textbook, there is some choice of language I'm unhappy with here. The characterization of missionaries as kind but misguided, and the mission system as a give and take, which, even if vaguely true, casts the ethnic cleansing and genocide of indigenous peoples and their cultures as but a well-intentioned mistake. And furthermore, the kid-friendly tone with the usage of language like "it made them unhappy" does also work to downplay the severity of the atrocities. However, this doesn't occur to me as revisionist nonsense. Reading this now, it seems to still be a scathing criticism of the California missionaries. The textbook even clarifies that many indigenous individuals were displaced from their homes and forced to live on these missions. The fact that the language was in some places soft and lenient cannot explain why we came to not care about it. So, who whitewashed history? What's the actual issue here? Well, here's my input. The real harm brought about by these textbooks and the education that stems from it is not that they present us lies, although they sometimes do. It is that they do signal us the truth, and then teach us to not go looking for it. Or, sometimes, more damagingly, tell us the truth, and then teach us to ignore it. We learned about ethnic cleansing and genocide. It was right there. And we did it again in middle school. But we didn't stop and think deeply about what that might entail. We learned it happened, sure, but we immediately went on to make pueblos out of clay or draw pictures of galleons, and soon after we moved on to the next thing because, chop chop, we've got to get to the gold rush by April. We became complacent in simply learning these summaries. We become primed to simply ingest it and move on. And by the time we actually do analysis or case studies in high school or college, many of us are already too jaded to care. As with the bland flavor of LaCroix, we know this history is just surface level. It's not nearly as sour, bitter, or sweet as real grapefruit. It's muted and empty. But this simulacrum of the real thing satisfies us. And after only a few sips in, you really can't taste it anymore, and now only feel the bubbles. And so, when we don't think about historical contexts outside of history class, our Eurocentric world where we speak English and eat hamburgers and dream of going to Paris reclaims Europe in our minds. So, should we shove the metaphorical grapefruit down kids' throats? Make the little kids really think about and consider the sanctioned murder and genocide of indigenous peoples? Probably not. But humor the question for a moment. How should we teach history, if not to elementary school children, but to those emotionally mature enough? Before the how, maybe it's fruitful to ask the why. Why do we teach history? What purpose ought a history class serve? The cliché answer is that those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. And sure, I suppose that's dandy, even though we do repeat history constantly and reject any comparisons to the past. But my answer to this question is as follows. History never ended. Its events affect us now. In fact, it's happening now, constantly. Everything that happens is history. And, thus naturally, no one can know all the history. And nonetheless, history is not a beast conquered by knowing it. It should be more important not to give a pile of truths, but paths to understanding. As with our tale of LaCroix, start from the real-life consequences of historical events, and chase those chains of cause and effect as far as they'll take you. And be open to perspective. History will need to keep being learned, heard, and evaluated. Just as we ought to be taught to speak our truths, we ought to be taught to not speak, and to listen, and to only thereby make value judgments. And, when we can, we ought to learn to unconditionally chase the flavor of real grapefruit.